Hi everyone. So we're kind of all from RMIT and interior design, and this is part of sort of lecture workshop series that we've started called Space Out. We'd love to thank everyone for coming, and thanks for Gideon and Robin for putting on this amazing show, and then even taking the time to stay back and have a chat with us. And we might just let you.
Okay, so we're going to basically just give a little bit of a background each about how we arrived, what we arrived with, and then I guess we'll just open up for questions and discussion as soon as possible. A couple of years ago, not quite a couple of years ago, but close to that, I was giving a presentation in a conference in America called PopTech, which is basically concerned with social change through innovations in science, culture, art, a bit of politics, certainly economics, and education. And there's a number of artists that were asked to give a presentation about their own work, and I gave a presentation about Glow Immortal Engine, which is works that I've worked with, one of them with Rob, and where we basically used the information of the dancers' movement to create real-time video and project that back onto the dancers. So the dancers essentially are seen through the light that their bodies, in a sense, are creating or influencing, both aesthetically and kinetically. So for me, it was kind of an extension of choreography. And it has quite a sophisticated soundtrack as well. That's also being triggered by certain cues in the show. Some of them are actually generated from movement, and some of them are pre-composed, but there's a great sense of liveness about the show. It's very, very present. And at this conference, Ruben, the sculptor, was giving this presentation, and he showed the videos of his work, and I was really impressed how these sculptures that were very similar to this one, very exposed, they're very exposed pieces. They didn't sort of try to hide anything or any kind of trickery or anything going on in the background that you couldn't see. And they're made often of wood and paper, sometimes recycled plastic, glass, steel. And these very concrete, obvious forms, once put into motion, really transcend themselves into something else. They become very organic, or almost like nature, almost like weather. It's incredibly beautiful and quite mesmerising. And I remarked to Ruben after we both talked, how I'm very interested in dance when dancers begin to dance and they sort of transform as well from being a person, a recognisable person, certain character and so forth, into a body in space. And so they're still themselves, but they're not themselves anymore. They kind of transcend their own personal selves and become something else. And this sort of, in dance for me, fluxes a lot. It kind of goes back and forth. I see the person, I don't see the person. I see the person, I don't see the person, according to how they're moving and how they're looking and what's going on. And he was very impressed with the presentation I gave, and we thought, well, actually, maybe we should work together and use strings to take information from dancers' movements and represent that information in sculptural form. And so it was kind of like this sort of 17th century mechanical sort of design that was relating to the digital stuff I'd been working on. And he doesn't really work in the digital realm at all, so everything of his is mechanical. And he comes from a mathematics background, and then from English, and then went into visual arts. He's very much now in visual arts. But his mathematics absolutely informs, I think, a lot of his work. And you can see that for him it's this thing about nature and maths. It's how the sort of modelling through maths to try to then create something that sort of looks like nature, or sort of find it through numbers and bits and pieces. And so last year he didn't come over here, but I went over to Berkeley, California, where he works a couple of times, a week at a time, and basically just sat around and talked a lot, did a lot of drawings, hung a lot of strings up and bits of wire and stuff to me in his garage kind of workshop area, and tried a whole lot of very basic things. And from that, started to create an idea of what this sculpture was going to look like, I was really keen for the sculpture to be built while we were rehearsing and modified, and the dancers sort of play with it and then say, okay, now I think this is working, so let's work on that. And Ruben very quickly said his works take weeks and weeks to make. They're very, very precise, and they're made off very specific technical drawings that he has to kind of really work out. So once we set what we're going to do, it can't really change. It can't really go through a process of a workshopping process like we can go in the studio. So there's not much point to that. So he built the sculpture in California, and I worked just with the dancers, mainly listening to some of Rob's music that was already recorded and some of Oren's music for about 5 weeks prior to Christmas. And we tried a whole lot of things, and Rob introduced me to a book of chaos mathematics, and I was reading a bit, not at all getting into the complexities of it, but sort of the basic ideas of it, and wanting that to inspire my choreography and work. And we started making some work. And my biggest problem was that until that time, Ruben has never worked on a performance piece. He's worked on a number of installations where his sculptures have been put in either a gallery space or a public space, and they're pretty much on. Usually a motor or something is running it, and usually at very slow speeds, and so it has this very mesmeric, slow, kind of endless, endless time kind of thing. It almost has this galactic quality. And the time arc for that is, a patron comes into the gallery, they see it, they leave, and that's kind of it. And I was saying to Ruben, I have a bit of a concern, because while dancers being attached to the sculpture is interesting, beyond about 10 or 15 minutes, this relationship really needs to develop. And in theatre, it's very important that things are there's a narrative going on. It may not be a story, it may not be a plot, but something has to inform the next thing, which then informs the next thing, and informs the next thing. It has to build and change and evolve or devolve, but it cannot stay in one spot, because that's not the role when you come in here and you sit. The paradigm really shifts. And that was my hardest, that was my biggest challenge. I didn't know how to, I knew that a dancer attached to this sculpture would look beautiful and could be an amazing relationship, but I didn't know how that would work over time in a theatre space. And then I was travelling around and I saw a documentary on Edward Bertinsky, who's a photographer, a Canadian photographer, and his works are sometimes called manufacturing landscapes, I think, or manufactured landscapes. He started off as a photographer photographing mines and railroad cuts or by the side of mountains. He was very interested in how people altered nature and what it looked like on a grand scale, on a massive scale. So these are massive mines, open cut mines, and erasing the top of a mountain to put a railway through and things like that. And so and he didn't photograph them as a kind of environmentalist showing this sort of degradation. He wanted to get this incredibly beautiful his work's called dystopic beauty or something like that. So he was showing these in these most incredible looking landscapes, all kind of beautiful but deeply disturbing at the same time, because you could see how they were kind of altered. And then he did a book about manufacturing. He went to China and he did a book about massive factories that basically on production lines that create thousands of millions of pieces with people sort of manually doing them. And then there was another one. He did a project about when those products and stuff that we buy, those goods erode or break or we chuck them out, what happens to them, or where do they go? And so there's these amazing landscapes of landfills and mountains of stuff for recycling or rubbish or disposed of in particular ways or badly disposed of. But again, this kind of returning. So it was this material that's taken from nature and what that looks like. Then it's manufactured and it's put together and what that kind of entails. And then it's returned back to nature, never the same again as it was in nature originally, in this different way. And so this kind of arc of material, actually, for me, was something I sort of clicked onto and thought about it and sort of talked with Ruben about it and said, well, what about we build the sculpture, or we can't build all of it, but we can build some of it. And we can also show through the dancing and through the movement this kind of the maths and particles and things coming together and kind of things that are chaotic that kind of actually then reveal that there is some kind of logic or sense by unison or repetition or canon. And then once we build it, then we animate the sculpture, we give it life, we connect it to people. And then once that starts, it starts an engine and it becomes autonomous, but it is invested from the dancer's movement. And then we do another piece, which is we just stop that, and then we look at the work as a finished work of art. And so we change the stage to a gallery space, an exhibition space, and we discuss the work in a different way, as a complete work of art, and how it kind of sits and how it's posited with just everyday people and life. And so this piece of contemporary art is sort of there, but people are talking about, you know, their jobs and stuff. And so, but that, it could have been about everyone, but I wanted to kind of focus on gallery guards because they're close to it, they are in the same space, but they're not there necessarily because they're art lovers. They're not there because they've studied art and they want to be close to it. They're there because it's a security job. Some of them are there because they love art and because they've studied art, but a lot of them are not. And so I was very interested in this kind of proximal relationship between someone who spends 7 hours a day around art, looking at art that's not there because of art, and talking to them about their life and their views, and just putting those two things together. And so in that sense, look, and it's kind of funny sometimes and sort of witty, but there's something kind of just uncomfortable about it, which I was trying to get, sort of this slightly oppressive sense of... And then that got me, once I talked to them about this idea of stolen and returned, so this idea that this artwork was stolen and more, and the feeling of when something is stolen on your watch, but then also the return for me was quite important, because when the cleaner almost destroys it in the dump master, he's told it's art, and he asks why was it art, and he's actually not given a good answer. He's just told, look, it was made by a famous artist or a very important artist, and that's the way he intended it. It's got to be hung it's got to be put in the gallery. And the curator's sort of relief that it's saved and saying it's a very important work, it's a very beautiful work, and so how the same work is, you know, in the same place, and the same people who kind of work there every day look at it very differently, and that was interesting to me, just purely because it just interests me. This idea of art and how it kind of relates to the world and how it relates to people. So we tried that, and I said to Rob, you know, I've got this idea, you know, to do this other bit, to do this gallery thing, and I'm not sure if it's going to work, and it's actually kind of a different work, and Rob seemed to be quite interested in that, so Rob sort of went, yeah, so it gave me confidence to go, okay, let's try it. So we did that, and then I think in the end I'm kind of merging the two, so there's a kind of a formalism in the guard choreography as such. I mean, you know, they're not real guards, and you know that they're dancers dressed as guards, you know, so I'm not trying to pretend that they're guards, but they're kind of voices of real guards speaking, and then so we choose to kind of see them as guards for that period of time. I choose to see them as guards, and then this idea of copying. I was very interested in copying and very interested in being one of the group and not standing out, and then doing this kind of militaristic kind of formalist movement that you would do maybe is a job like this job, but then revealing again the human nature of it, and so it becomes play after a while, and so this idea of games and competition, and then it's a bit more abstract after that. The copying becomes more expressive, and then they kind of, these mandalas on the floor for me, again, more like nature a bit, like this sort of central point that gives information that goes out, a little bit like the sculpture as well, and these mandalas start on the floor and then they end up doing like these kaleidoscopic or symmetrical paper cuts that are moving in the foreground as those silhouettes, so you get this kind of fan shape. Again, like the sculpture, and then kind of the merging of those two. So these people sort of meet together as one kind of, sort of, as the sort of alloy themselves with the visual arts and the human thing. I'm not sure how well that works, but that's kind of how I sort of decided to kind of conclude it. Now I don't have to say anything. It's all done.
Well, that was pretty comprehensive. From my point of view, I guess the first contact I had with the ideas behind this work were after Gideon had met Ruben, obviously, and he showed me a video of the kinetic sculptures and the way that they moved in this very, well, incredibly sinusoidal way, this idea of simple wave motion. And these, just having two simple waves intersecting, and that was enough to create something so kind of organically fluid and beautiful that you could watch it for days. And of course, when you work with sound, the sine wave is really the fundamental unit that you start with. You know, it's almost a problem. The sine wave is almost a problem that you're presented with at the beginning of thinking about anything to do with sound, and particularly to do with electronic sound and working digitally with sound. So I was immediately sort of drawn to this sculpture and its sinusoidal nature, and then also intrigued with how Gideon was talking about interrupting that with human sort of intervention by rigging a person up to that. And also really interested in his thoughts about chaos and swarming and these things that I've been fundamentally interested in, I think, for a long time. So, and I worked in collaboration on this piece with Oren Ambachi, who is kind of a rock star, which is kind of interesting. So, plays beautiful guitar. And at first, actually, when Gid suggested it, I wasn't entirely convinced by that idea, but I thought it worked beautifully in the end, and I thought the combination actually between the digital aspects of the score and the more organic aspects of the score, and the times when we fused together to make music that neither of us would have made independently of one another, I thought that was a really, really rewarding and satisfying experience in the end for me, and hopefully it works. I think it works really well with the piece. But a lot of the way that I work with sound is very similar to this idea of chaos and swarming, and one thing sort of being, they call it sort of sensitive dependence on initial conditions, which is the butterfly effect idea. So one thing happening, that affects the next thing, which then affects the next thing, which then sort of has this rippling effect. And I think the opening track of the work is very much about that. It's actually 5 identical tracks offset by a fraction of a second. And so what happens over the course of that whole opening section is that things come in and out of phase, and they sort of sound familiar, but they're recontextualized, and the rhythmic impulsion is really similar but never identical all the way through the piece, that opening section. So I think that gives you some idea of how you would work with the relationships when you're sort of talking about these ideas and thinking about them sonically as well as visually and as well as dramatically. So that was very much the way that Oren and I approach things as well, working very much, just to give it some context, this is only the second dance work that I've worked on, really, a large one, and the first one was with Gideon on Mortal Engine, where I was working with audio-controlled laser systems, and we were working on tracking dancers with laser light, and also with making my role, and that was also making some interactive sound work with the video tracking system he was talking about. And in a way, I think it's a brilliant piece, and particularly technologically, I found it really stimulating. But in a way that was almost, for me, a bit distracting. I never really got involved as much as in this piece with composing music in a very dramaturgical sense, with a sort of almost like I know you don't like to think of narratives, but I see this really as a narratorial kind of score in a way. So for me, I found that process really, really interesting as well. But also I guess speaking to interior design students, it's worth talking about space and the way that sonic and physical aspects were working in the piece. I love working in different spaces, and I love having the resources to have a sound system that can cover a spectrum from almost 0 to painful in amplitude, but also in frequency spectrum. And I love old buildings like this that vibrate in so many different places. You can kind of have a really nice time tuning the space. But there's something really beautiful about filling a space with sound simply so that you can then extract it all. And so I also love creating enough depth in the sonic image that you can then have a kind of purity and stasis and silence that corresponds to that. And I also worked with the lighting designer, Ben Cistern, to try and create a relationship. And this is something Gid was really interested in doing from the start. Is try and create a relationship somehow synesthetically between this undulation in the sculpture and the sound and the lighting sort of working together to create some kind of sort of... And in the end, we made a really subtle... We made that very subtle, much more subtle than Mortal Engine was, which was kind of really full on in terms of the synesthetic relationships. So in the gallery section, you may not even have noticed it, but there's a tone that sort of locks in with the undulation of the sculpture, and it kind of draws you in a little bit, hopefully. And then the lighting starts to sort of just undulate with that as well. And it was just really, again, working with this sinusoidal shape and just making all of the sinusoidal shapes in the space lock together. So all the ones you were hearing and the ones you were seeing, and, you know, so the ones that you were seeing physically in the sculpture, but also the ones that you were then experiencing just as a shift in the light tone. And I think that was a really effective thing. And if you didn't notice it, I actually think that's just as good, you know, as if you did, because it's almost subliminal, I think, in that part of the work.
And I think in the gallery scene, it creates this psychological space for me, which is what I like, is that these men and women are talking about fairly mundane things, and they're doing fairly mundane things, but the space is sort of shifting, and this kind of contrast between people not doing much and not saying much, and the space gives it this edge, or gives it this tension. I think that's very effective.
Yeah, it's quite tense, I think, and it also builds. So there are sections in that gallery scene where the undulation gets a little bit quicker, and the effect on the light gets a little bit deeper. There's about 4 points where the sort of intensity increases towards the sort of game where it reaches its peak.
I have sort of noticed that even, I'm not sure if it was that scene and even connecting that with Mortal Engine, because I think even a few of us came as a group to see the show then, as well as that connection between what you're talking about, the watching these dancers and their movement and that sort of complete environment and sound. I know I find I slip into that moment and just there's a swaying or there's a pulsing and that you either snap out of, or the complete opposite, where especially the sound I found from the past 2 shows was that complete takeover to the point where my heart's racing and I know I should just relax and swallow and take it easy, but it's just that complete build-up. So that's incredible to hear you talk about how actually you've worked the light and the sound in different levels of the theatre to connect to that.
Yeah, that was something I was wondering about before, whether sort of thinking about the connection between light and sound and which, like, whether they do feed off each other. And it's kind of interesting to hear you talk about it in a mathematical sense as well, because there was that sort of dimming, and it was very, very, subtle. And then, which made the sort of, you had these, I say beats, but it was actually silence, or like major changes in lighting where that became even more powerful, even though it's like cut everything out or just change something, and because there was so much going on that. And sort of, when did you choose those moments, or how did you think about, like, was that?
They're very much your choices, I think.
Oh,
the dramatic changes. Yeah.
And there's some that, Rob just went, that's not working. Just like, I mean, there's a big cut. There's a big cut in which you were saying we did this fade. It was really annoying, and there's one bit just before the gallery starts, or as into the gallery, you know, we tried to do this sort of smooth kind of segue, and it was just stupid in the end. And he just built up so much volume, and then just cut it, and that was really effective. Like and then you realise the size. You realise how loud that was only when
it's gone.
Only when it's gone.
Yeah,
There's lots of space.
Change in presence.
And you
can only hear the motor actually, because it cuts off, and all you can hear is the motor kind of whirring away.
Yeah.
And it's like turning the.
And then this dancer starts talking.
Yeah.
And just thinking, she's talking. It's like, oh wow, is she talking? Like, you know. And I think that's quite a dramatic. It's a way of just really shifted around. And it takes you almost, for me, it takes me a few seconds. Not now. When Stephanie started talking, it took me a few seconds to go, she really, like, you know, and then what is she saying? You know, there's this kind of thing. So some things are, you know, require, you know, very, very quick things, and some things are slow. But I mean, Rob's had quite a history of kind of these sort of psychoacoustic kind of situations, and that's what drew me to him in the first place. So he certainly hadn't started doing this with Chunky Move. It's something I think Rob's been interested in for a while and working on. And I'm very interested in, you know, for me, working in live performance, I think there's a big difference in working in live shows now as opposed to maybe over 100 years ago, where that was kind of really the main, before motion picture film and before screen projection, that was really the main way of conveying stories and narrative and ideas and so forth. And now it's not. Now it's kind of one, you know, very few people watch live shows, and when they do watch live shows, it's a very tiny percentage of what they're kind of immersing themselves in or taking in. So to work in something that's so, you know, so sparse in people's experience, I'm very interested in the liveness of it. So I certainly work with a lot of technology, but the use of the technology that I work with is really to bring back the liveness of it rather than to imagine it shifted somewhere else. And I think that this use of light and sound working together, so you're not just watching the show, it's actually affecting, you're absorbing it in different layers into your body, and rather than just something on a, you know, that's kind of divorced from you.
But
You're in the space itself.
And the thing about that is that it's something that can only happen when you're sitting in the room, psychoacoustically and neurologically, because you can't. You know, if you're watching that on a television, it's just going to look. You're just going to go up and hit the TV. You think it's sort of broken, or the brightness or contrast is gone. You know, so it's bringing it into. I mean, that's what makes the live experience.
And from a design point of view, actually, we haven't talked much about design, but if you guys want to, you know, the scale of things is very important. How things affect you. So if you're going to have subsonic frequencies that kind of go through you, they have to be at a certain scale for them to actually be effective. You know, they have to be tuned in a particular way. Or if you have lights that you see is sort of almost bending, is what I call it, like changing, you can't just have it on a small space. You need to have it a vast space for it to work effectively. So that really informed the floor that we used, because initially we were going to use a black floor and we wanted this thing floating in black. So it's, you know, you saw this sculpture floating in black. And once we started talking about this sort of undulating of light responding to sound, we started to look at tests. It was like clear that unless you're going to have a big surface for that, it's not going to be effective at all. So, you know, that changed because of the sound.
Because when I saw some photos of when you were doing rehearsals, that was in the timber kind of floor, and the sculpture was sort of in there. So, I mean, did you test it in there as well, like covering with layers of things?
Well, Rob and Ben tested it against a wall on white paper, so we looked at it on a much smaller scale first.
With a chair.
With a chair, just to see how it... and then once we were convinced with that, we laid eventually a white floor in the studio. So we were looking at a white floor, and we tried a few bits and pieces, but we couldn't really do the full thing in the studio because we weren't really set up for it. I think the test...
He's got a lot of lights up there. We didn't have that kind of brightness, because the way the gallery scene just becomes so stark that you're kind of almost shying away from it. You couldn't get that kind of...
Yeah, there was a coldness and a warmthness in the changes of light.
Yeah, I think there's 4 different whites in the white.
Yeah, he was very different. He was interested in grades of white, like having white but very different shades of it. And he would talk about warm white and cold white.
And they never sit in one place for very long. They're always phasing. They're always in a process of change, whether it's very slow or faster.
And so kind of choreographing the piece in the sort of studio in a much smaller space, and then sort of having it here, like, because the audience is, you know, from here, I didn't even realise there were like seats up there. Did a lot change when you got here and you realised there were people sort of watching from here and watching from here?
No, because not really. The stuff is very specific, and we're only here for a couple of days really setting up before we had to get things going. So, but we actually have a very big studio, so we were able to mark out that complete space, and we installed the sculpture, not initially in this relationship. We had a different relationship and we couldn't get this space, but the last 2 weeks in the studio we pretty much had the exact space. The thing we couldn't do is we couldn't sit away from it. Like the wall against the floor was about where. So we were sitting where those front row is on chairs, the same line as the, and that's actually for choreography is very disturbing, because you make bad decisions often when you're close in relation to how people see it later. So that's hard work to try to imagine.
What sort of bad decision? What causes the bad decisions? Just
You
the
can't,
detail.
you can't see large patterns of movements very
Right.
well. So you can watch the micro sort of detail and relationships, and you think, wow, that's so, and then you realise that actually when you watch it in the theatre, the rules are different,
Yeah.
and big movements or cannons or ripples and things like that actually become very, very powerful. So things like things that annoyed me when I walked into the theatre was, I was kind of interested in the dancers building the sculpture during the first part, but in the studio where I'm like this and so the sculpture's kind of there and that dance is there and I'm kind of looking at that dance because that's the most interesting thing. But here, I'm sitting midway up, I'm kind of got this guy that's constantly kind of clicking away while someone's doing something like that. I'm like, could you stop that? Like, slow down and don't be so distracting, and that was impossible for me to imagine in the studio, and I kind of made a bit of an error in how I did it, mainly with the lighting design, because we decided to sidelight the whole opening section of the work. And with sidelight, of course, it'll hit everything in its path. So you can't decrease that area and increase that area. Everything's equal. So it gave this kind of democracy of focus across the stage, which I really didn't want. I wanted to control it. I wanted people just to, oh, look at that, we're building a sculpture. Isn't that interesting? Now stop looking at that. They'll continue doing that. So the lighting design actually changed, and I gave Ben a real headache actually for quite a few days, because every time he was showing me the design in the studio, I was going, yeah, that's great, yeah, that's kind of, yeah, hang it up, yeah, great. Then I came in here, sat up there, went, it doesn't work. so those things happen, and I mean, I would recommend, what I try to do in the studio as much as possible is pretty much recreate the space I'm working in as much as possible, and try to get away from it as much as possible distance-wise. Of course, that's not really possible all the time.
Did you have to model that in a computer? Like, did you model it on the computer before you actually started designing it, or
No, I don't think
a system to have to actually work in the mechanics of it and get all the proportion?
I think Ruben works with the sort of a quill and a pot of ink.
Yeah.
It's really, he's the Renaissance basically. And
He can do emails, and that's about as, I mean, seriously,
one letter at a time.
that's about as computer as he gets.
Yeah.
Because
But
it does
certainly
have-
the production crew had to model it simply for its spatial
Yeah.
logistics
I can see
in the
it
space.
being modelled quite, not easily, but
Yeah.
you can imagine, sort of having a plane or having a cube and then coming down
Yeah.
and having all these measurements and actually being able to control it quite easily on a computer. But I mean, that said,
Yeah.
in real scale, life scale would just be a complete.
Yeah.
So were there then any surprises, like as to how he was imagining its movement, with obviously the pulling of the strings, and then when it was attached to actual bodies? I mean, did it just do what he was thinking it would do, or did other things kind of come into play that were surprises? Or
Yeah, well, okay, so there were a few problems, and they were kind of pretty much basic kind of physics problems. One was that we started with the idea of having a 1-to-1 ratio of movement. So the dancer moves this amount, and the sculpture responds with the same amount. But the weight of that was very, very high. And so engineering-wise, he put it through a pulley system where it was a 1-to-2 ratio, which made it much smoother. It gave it a much smoother, it was too erratic. And that had to be designed actually in Berkeley when we were there, because we had to make those decisions at that time. And so that gave it this sort of very smooth quality, and it actually made it easier to operate. But then that had two major problems that came with that. One was that the dancers had to move twice as much or twice as far to get the same response from the sculpture. because it was moving at 50% the rate of the dancer was. And that was a real problem. I mean, that was becoming a problem because, the dancer's doing this and the sculpture's kind of going, all of that. The other thing was friction return. So what happened is that it was okay for the dancer to pull, and that was kind of quite good. But in the release, unless you have enough counterweight for the pulley system, the response was there was a lag. There was a lag response that was pretty noticeable, and a problem. And then, so to overcome that, the only thing you can do is increase the weight of the sculpture, so the counterweight. But then, if you put all the pulleys, all the strings from 4 people to 1, that person's holding like a massive amount of weight. So we're always trading the whole time with these numbers and these things, because we couldn't increase the weight, because when Alistair had all the sculpture, he was literally being dragged into the loom. If we lessened the weight, then the latency return and the friction overcame the weight. So we have a bad response. If we went to 1-to-1, then it became all jerky. So these are the things that you kind of all the time. And it's kind of interesting working with artists or kind of engineers, because you have to have your kind of creative idea, and then then you have the reality, the very practical reality. And we kind of like those practical realities. They're kind of the fun.
They are fun. Yeah.
Fun bits that sort of keep you up at night and think, how do you do that?
That relationship, the 1-to-2, was not apparent. It seemed the opposite.
Yeah.
And that's where, when you were talking about chaos and swarm, I'd sort of picked that up before you mentioned it, so I was really gratified to hear that it was
Well, one of the things we realised was there's 22 strings, and we put them in basically in parallel originally, and we were moving. So we did one plane, one sine wave plane across here, and then the other one down that way, and we had them as pretty much as straight as possible on Alistair. And so there's 2 things I want to say. One was the single body, and it was really lame. It just didn't. He was moving as much as you can, and the sculpture was doing this. But what we did was we split the wave. So if you imagine 1 to 11, we went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 returned back. So he was actually, with that movement, he was pulling 2 opposite ends of the sculpture, and so it increased. So the complexity became in how the strings went to him. And if you look behind him, they're not straight. They're actually all interwoven, but that's all mathematically worked out. And we did that the same with the legs. So he was able to get a lot more influence over the sculpture and we only could arrive at that when we were in Melbourne, looking at the problem, just going, oops, it doesn't really move.
That cause and effect relationship between dancer and installation was really beautifully anticipated by the first dancers scene, with their beautiful movements together, with the knocking and the so that sort of
yes.
reactive was just exquisite.
Did you find that, like, basically as you learnt how to make this sculpture dance, did that then feed back into the choreography? So did you learn something from the machine and then put the sculpture and then that feed? Was
not
kind of
really in this situation.
give and take?
We became quite obsessed with the planes of the sculpture and how we could make this bowl shape, and how we could. What was interesting was the shapes that the dancers were making. Were they're kind of almost in the dark, but if you look downwards at their shapes, they're very interesting geometric shapes that when the 4 dancers are connected, they create these very interesting clear shapes. Like when they're making the bowl, it's actually a zigzag, a very kind of defined zigzag and things like that. So these relationships were interesting, but no, we didn't really feed that back into the other stuff.
I really also, when you were speaking about the weight that on the one dancer, Alistair, I mean, I was really struck by that as well, of just not just making the sculpture move, but actually, this whole sort of sense of labour that was there a little bit.
Yeah.
And like also, and with the body, and just how in the gallery scene as well, that even though there wasn't the kind of physical string connection, still the body's kind of labouring in the sense of, like, having to pace up and down the floor or stand there, how it was still, Because it was just so extraordinarily beautiful, the sculpture. But I kept thinking of Hal in Space Odyssey as well. Just this kind of menace, a little bit,
Right.
that sort of was organising stuff. Kind of
presence in the room.
And so this kind of mechanical, like loom-like thing, but still it was just this thing that somehow the relationship to the body, it was sort of organising the bodies as much as the bodies were kind of organising it in some ways. And then the mandala thing at the end, I actually felt that was a bit more like how they were sort of conforming to this thing, and they were sort
Becoming
of
it.
becoming it.
Yeah. People looking like they're dogs or something like. Well, I mean,
Or succumbing to it,
right.
like the.
Well, I think the guards are kind of servicing the sculpture. They're there in a way because the artwork's there, and so they're kind of the people who serve it, and it becomes this thing, above and controlled by strings and
autonomous at that point.
Yeah.
Just have one I just had one question, and it was about probably a naive question, but about what comes first in a way, in terms of like at what point does the dance come into the process, and is it something that's interpretive, or is it driving the whole process, or like in terms of sound and light and the kind of the sculpture, is it just looping on itself, or is it fairly linear? Or?
There are things that a lot of things actually all come in. It's a hard one to answer. It's a good question, but there's a combination of answers for that, and it changes from work to work. But I think there are a number of things that are happening simultaneously. So there's a number of discussions that happen. I mean, here the first thing that happened was Ruben looked at Mortal Engine on video, and I looked at his work on video and went, wow, there's something about this, and why don't we do something together? So that was and we never thought it was more than going to be, a few experiments in California in his workshop with one person and a sculpture, or making a sculpture. And then when that kind of idea kind of developed, then the idea of maths was kind of interesting to me, and I was talking to Rob, and I started to read that book, and then when I started work with it, then I thought, well, I want to make stuff. I knew the sculpture was going to be autonomous at some point, and I wanted the dancers to be autonomous, and then they meet in the middle, so they begin, they connect, and then it kind of becomes autonomous. But I wanted to, and Ruben's very interested in maths and this idea of how things are going to come together. So we started working on things that had nothing to do with the sculpture in a way. I mean, the movement's not connected to it, not in a literal way, but it's about fragments that kind of come together. When are things uniform, and when do things break up? One thing influencing another, cause and effect. So we were trying experiments, which I guess choreography kind of is. It's kind of this play, serious play, based on those things, knowing that that's how Ruben and Rob kind of also make their work. So we were kind of all working separately, but thinking about similar things. And then in the end, we put them together, and they do actually share. They're not separate. They come together because the initial ideas were very similar ideas. But it's interesting how they do come together. I mean, because they're very different forms, and that's the kind of craft, I guess. It's sort of how do you put that in one thing?
I was just going to say, actually, I found it strangely moving, and I was trying to understand why I was responding emotionally to it. And I do actually think it is because of those subtle connections, but particularly, well, for me, because of the sound, between the sound and the light, and the undulations and the movement, and the way things were kind of moving a little bit that we weren't necessarily aware of.
Yeah.
Because I found it actually really, in the end, I think, why am I finding this moving?
Yeah.
And I think it's also introducing that human element. Too.
I mean, that duet, that partnering with that Alistair and Marnie, the man and the woman in the sculpture, like that's a thing when you've been working with dance for a while, or working with man-woman stuff or couples. It's like it's got the big, huge beware kind of stuff comes up immediately when you start working in the studio, because it falls into a cliche like that. I mean, it's already a cliche when you start, so you're kind of already fighting this huge tide that's already against you in that area. And I think we're all kind of sensitive of that, but still felt that it was important. Well, I felt it was important to go there.
But I found it really moving when they came back after they'd done their guard stuff. When those really quite mechanical movements.
That sort of mandala
Yeah.
type.
No, it wasn't the mandala. No, it was something else. And I do
In the
think that
guard.
Rob was talking about the subtle